Greetings, everyone. Welcome to your affirming interfaith community, hoping to uplift you wherever you're at, spiritually, physically. We are so happy to be connected with you today. If you haven't joined us before, this community considers itself an interfaith community based from mystical Christianity called Swedenborgianism. There's a lot of differences between that Christianity and others. You can read about them, hear about them here. We may not be focusing too much on those differences tonight, but I thought it might be nice for you to find out who you're joining for the first time. And if you are joining for the first time, then you don't know that sometimes we like to play a little music as we get settled. So please, as you take a few breaths, I'm going to play my random notes as we turn inward and allow divinity to illuminate our thinking, our hearts. Today, our message is entitled, When Truth Feels Like a Yoke. Well, I hope it doesn't feel like a yoke to you today. I hope today you can turn towards your rationality, wisdom, and love in your thinking, in peace and calmness, as you hope to uplift it in others. So take a few breaths before we get started, coming into the moment. Coming in to yourself. And I want to remind you all to subscribe on whatever podcasting apps you use. We're also on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And we are all about community here. Yes, I mentioned uplifting each other, and part of that involves communication. It involves touching base. So I just want to say hello to you folks in the Chatsy. How are you doing this evening? Good to see you there. I want to announce also that we are making a switch to Spreaker, which is another podcasting platform, hopefully this week. I've been testing, I've been working on the move. Right now we use something called Blog Talk Radio. It's actually being merged with Spreaker eventually, and Spreaker has a lot of added benefits, but it takes a little work getting there. So we're going to test it out this Thursday when we have an informal discussion and kind of play some Swedenborgian music. There's new music from David Feckety. If you know Reverend David Feckety, in our interview with him recently, he shared some of his musical processing. And so we're going to play some of that, play some other music as we talk and catch up with each other. But I want to get more towards the heart of the matter today. Truth is an interesting subject. We all have our different truths, our different ideas of how the world works, even if we say we're scientific, if we say we're Christian, if we say we're Muslim, atheists, what have you. Our ideas are never quite perfect, and we're always learning more. Hopefully we accept that premise. I know scientists esteem themselves in trying to accept that premise in their work. I think a lot of healthy religious folks, spiritual folks, do too. And that is the premise of leaning into rationality, thinking about how we think, how we're putting A and B together to get to C, and really being concerned with honesty, with fairness, with how things really work. In today's world, it may sometimes seem like that doesn't mean a whole lot. With our politicians the way they are, with our world the way it is, how some of us dismiss some of the issues in the world perhaps, how we can often overlook our own problems within. But, given that world, maybe we are called to an even higher integrity towards truth or living towards truth. But really, what does that mean in our context with the title, When Truth is a Yoke? Well, the Reverend Grant Odner shares his thoughts about this, but he doesn't go too far into defining truth for us in this message, which may be a helpful thing. Often in our Swedenborgian context, in this community, we like to talk about, we each find our own spiritual truths as well. We each find how we connect to divinity on our own, and we're each called to living up to that in a different way, but that doesn't mean anything goes. I really think that we should critically look at our minds and our hearts and try to discern what is truly wise and true for us, and try to live up for it, live up to it, and let it flow through us. If we don't, often we're just defining ourselves as the truth, defining ourselves as the standard bearer, and we tend to judge other people and dismiss them, or maybe we let them do whatever they want, but we mistreat each other. I think we all have some semblance of or idea of what's fair and true. But the dictionary calls it that which is true, or what truth is, something that is in accord with fact or reality. And it also says, to kind of caveat that, a fact or belief that is accepted as true. I think the truth of life, your spiritual journey, can always grow. We're not infinitely wise like the divine one, like the higher power. We have room to get to receive really more wisdom and insight from above. But why find truth, and why care? Why seek it, and why try to really live it? Well, we'll talk a little more about living truth. But our scriptures make a big deal about this, and they often say this will bring us peace. A lot of the wise sages across time kind of center everything that they share around that premise of finding peace, of releasing suffering, perhaps like in Buddhism, finding peace of love like in some forms of Christianity, Swedenborgianism, finding goodness in our lives and living that goodness like in Islam. It takes many different forms in our translations and how we put it, but often there's a common thread if we're willing to see it. As Grant Odner shares, though, often it is difficult to keep the Lord's promise before us of that peace, as we find in Christian scripture. The promise of rest from the labor of reformation, as Grant calls it. And he says, when the frustration of inner conflict and self-compulsion is upon us, it seems as if life had always been this way and always will be. So Grant makes the point, okay, so there's this promise in Scripture, in our relationship with the divine through the environment around us, of finding peace. But what does that mean? Well, let's delve in. And to do so, let us turn towards our typical liturgical elements that truly, I hope, speak to us of some deeper things. So if you're watching me, you can tell I've just opened my scripture in front of me. Opening scripture, for me, often represents how divinity speaks to us from a deep place within our sacred texts, through the poetry of the sages of divinity, perhaps, trying to illuminate our thinking and our living. But it may mean something else for you. And as we typically do, I'm also lighting our candle on our altar, representing, for me today, how truth illuminates, but as we try to move closer, perhaps to see things better, sometimes it also hurts a little bit. And that brings us to that last word in the title of today's message, which you can read on our website, swedenborgiancommunity.org. when truth feels like a yoke. And that's yoke. Yoke, the burden of truth, because sometimes it is a yoke. I don't know if you've encountered this. Share, if you have, how you have with us. But often living up to our high ideals, truly trying to live up to them, which sometimes saying a lot. I often don't hold myself accountable for living up to my higher ideals, right? But truly feeling called to live up to them and trying to, and then doing that work can often feel like a struggle, like conflict, perhaps between brothers. Our scripture today is about such brothers, Esau and Jacob, sons of Isaac. Esau is the firstborn twin. Jacob, of course, came next, but Jacob ends up stealing Esau's blessing, the blessing of the firstborn. Now, what does that mean? Well, depends on the scholars, but we get a good idea from Scripture, and that is that Esau would have taken over the estate, taken over the running of things in Isaac's house, but Jacob takes it. He pretends to be Esau and tricks his father, who's lying in bed, and Jacob doesn't really seem to care. He doesn't really seem to reflect on this at all, feeling as though, you know what, I'm a twin, I might as well have been firstborn, maybe I'm better at certain things than Esau, I'm going to go ahead and steal this, it's really mine. I think we can often get into similar situations in our own lives, and maybe not as clearly dichotomous, like I'm clearly not the firstborn, or at least that's what the nursemaid said. But I think often we put ourselves first when actually we should serve and maybe uplift things in other people, allow them to do their work. But as Grant mentions, a lot of times these stories have these spiritual metaphors just within ourselves. And he relates these characters, as Swedenborg does, to the goodness of life, being Esau, the firstborn, the true firstborn, and the truth of life, the wisdom we find as Jacob. And Esau should be the firstborn. We should really be living our goodness, living it out, following it. And that takes being in truth. It takes being in healthy living and wisdom and knowing how to live with people appropriately. And that takes some discernment. So interestingly enough, Jacob stealing this blessing, according to Swedenborg and according to Reverend Odiner, represents this process of having to follow truth first before we can really get to goodness. Because often we need to learn and live up to our learning, and that takes a process. And that's the yoke that often feels so tough. And with that, I want to take a few moments and connect with you all in the chatzy, because believe it or not, folks, my ordination doesn't mean a whole lot, let's be honest. I did go through a process of discernment, learning, but in relative terms, you could be much wiser than me, is what I mean by that. So I often find the wisdom in our chatzy and you helps illuminate this community in ways I never could alone. So how are you doing, folks? Good to see a few more people in there. And what's going on? So Albert mentions Reverend David Feckety's dedication of musical is laudable. What's interesting about music, I find, is it tends to ease the yoke of trying to live into truth. I don't know about you, but without music, I would find the daily struggle where it occurs to be much harder. It was the music of my spirit, the music that I love to listen to physically, of course. Thank you, Albert, for sharing that. And Albert also says, I've been reflecting on how much I am not in actual control of my life, but rather activities and direction are actually given to me from the source. And that's something that we find quite often in this community and in Swedenborgian thought and in other traditions as well, this acknowledgement of source. And I really think that's powerful, Albert. Thank you for sharing that. When I was playing around with Spreaker this week, I was kind of hesitant because, I'm used to Blog Talk Radio. We're connecting okay, I hope, right now through Blog Talk Radio. If you're live, or even if you find the podcast somewhere else, as most of you do, on iTunes or Android somewhere, it started in Blog Talk Radio. It has a loving place in my heart. There's a loving feeling towards it, despite some of the hiccups sometimes. But I felt called to live towards a higher truth, let's say, to embody a healthier connection with other people, you could also say, to have more forms of being that I think you all will enjoy. I think that's kind of a good, if I may say so myself, right? That's kind of a good metaphor for living up to a wisdom. You may find that wisdom anywhere, often, in our experiences, in our scriptures, especially, I think, in our scriptures and our willingness to open ourselves to the source and her illumination, her wisdom. And I think that the Lord, through our scripture and all these things and our lives, calls on us to step up to Spreaker. No, to live a better embodiment. Always, right? Always. But there's some discrete degrees there. There's some jumps sometimes that we have to make. And those can be difficult. Those can have a yoke. And I love what Albert shares, especially because when we remember that the power to take that step up, the staircase, to start to really try to embody some of the things that are calling to us in our living, in our intending towards other people often. Often we have to look at our intentions and try to, dispel the destructiveness, dispel the selfishness, and receive a little bit more neighborly love for divinity and other people, love for God's qualities, the lady's qualities around us and within us. And it takes that introspection, but it also takes really wanting to embody that and really believe, perhaps through a little experience, that that's the way to heaven. Whether or not you believe in the afterlife, folks, I think trying to live that type of life where we shed our selfishness actually brings a lot of joy, gratitude, and peace within, which is the promise of so many scriptures. And Paige shares a few things about her life right now and the weather and getting around. That's, I don't know about you, but I'm surrounded by snow here in Canada, and it's actually really nice right now. It's relatively warm, still very snowy out there, but often it can be hard to move around and get around. And my heart calls out to all the folks, making their way in a world that often isn't the easiest to take a step forward. And I want you to know that you are empowered, you are wonderful, you're beautiful, whoever you are, every single person, truly, because it comes from divinity. It comes from the life within, and it's you. You're receiving perhaps a finite amount. We're not glowing like suns here, but it's still from God. It's still from the holy. And we're still trying to receive more God, receive more Jesus Christ, receive more Allah in our living. Because even if you want to say God is not a person, God is not anything like us, I think often you have to say, if you believe in divinity, that God is all-knowing and all-compassionate, all-loving. All-compassionate is a term that Muslims use. Of course, Christians also use similar terms. Jews as well. Hindus have a lot of wonderful ideas about the blessedness of divinity, the loving nature, the giving nature of God, especially when we're receiving and willing to receive and willing to give as well. Thank you, all you folks. I want to stay there in the chat seat, but I also am aware of time, and so I thank you deeply. So we kind of heard the Jacob, Esau, Isaac story. For the most part, no, we didn't, right? It doesn't end with just Jacob stealing the blessing. It actually follows not Esau, who seems to be the hero so far of this story, but Jacob. Because Jacob steals the blessing, but it's like, peace, I'm out of here. I'm scared of my older brother. Look at how hairy he is. Actually, it says how hairy he is. It's kind of funny. Look at what he does. He's a very capable person. I'm gone. I got my blessing. I'm going to go do other things. And interestingly enough, despite the theft, Jacob has a really tough time out in the world, and has to work, has to develop relationships, grow and grow and grow. And that's often like our journey with truth. We may not feel like we're quite to that good stage. We're not entirely blessed in our actions and our living, but we're trying to live up to it. We've learned some things, some self-care stuff that we apply towards other people, which is probably the way we should approach even self-care, kind of like a universal self-care. And as we live that out, as we work it out, we may often feel like we're not getting anywhere, that maybe the more destructive, perhaps you might call it evil parts of us, are sometimes ahead in certain moments. In every moment, I don't know. It can often feel like a yoke, as it's put. And yet, I think the moment you're willing to reflect and try to live up to it, even hope that your intentionality will start to change, want to, right? You start making some real headway because conscience appears. Divinity in another upgrade within your spirit appears, and it's a major one, folks. Conscience. It is amazing to start to develop it and to want to do good, to live up to truth. And it's also a process of figuring out truth, and I think that's part of it too. It's one thing to have truth and then try to live it, and it's another thing to be willing to say, you know what, I have some truth, but this thing's going to get deeper, this is going to get wider, it's going to call me to more and more action, social justice, changing in my intentions, etc., etc. But really, it's just intentions, actions, right? But it's going to keep calling me to higher things, and that's going to be a process in and of itself. But lo and behold, eventually there may come a day where your Jacob comes back home, and guess what? Esau embraces Jacob. Jacob's kind of nervous, right? Jacob's heading home, splitting his household, is ready to give like half of what he has to Esau, and Esau sees him, the guy who is shrifted, and Esau just runs and hugs and kisses Jacob, embraces Jacob, despite the past. He just missed his brother, and he wanted to know that he was okay, for him to know that they were okay, and that he loved him. And so he hugs and kisses him, shows a true connection, a true embrace. And the twins, I think, from there, largely, at least metaphorically, right, come back to represent kind of this holistic place where I think we're each called to try to find where we actually feel like our lives are living up to our truths, where we're making some real headway, we're more at peace with ourselves, maybe we're at peace with ourselves, I don't know. If you're a Buddha, perhaps, no. Hopefully that is possible, and I think it is. In fact, every major scripture in this world that I know of says that. And so why not have that as the goal, as the promise, that that's the way God works, bringing Jacob home to Esau, and Isaac's embrace. And with that, I want to take a few moments to reflect and pray together, thinking about that story of the separated brothers, how it often feels too late to make amends, to reconnect, and to embrace. And yet, in God, all things are possible, and it is never too late. Perhaps those people in our lives we've let down don't embrace us when we come back. But it's okay for you to embrace the goodness that comes from the lessons learned from your past. It's okay for you to allow that call to higher loving embrace you in your life, in your heart, even if the people that you might have hurt or disappointed don't embrace you back. None of us are perfect. It's not all a black circle where you're evil incarnate. We each have room to grow. There's yin yang in all our spirits, perhaps until divinity upholds us in justice in heaven. I don't know. Perhaps until you find that peace where you accept yourself and accept the workings of love in your heart. I'm not sure. It sounds just about right. And let us listen to a song by Reverend David Feckety called Gratitude as we turn to prayer. And another one from David Feckety called Prayer. hope you enjoyed that beautiful music by the Reverend David Feckety. You know what? I feel called to really embody our sermon from today, and although I probably can't live up to it entirely physically, I think I can read it a little bit. So this is from the beginning and end of the sermon from Reverend Grant Odner, and he starts by quoting Genesis 27:40. And it shall come to pass, when you shall have the dominion, you shall break his yoke from off your neck. And the words of the Reverend. These words express a promise of liberation. Liberation from the frustrations of a life of truth. We all have some idea of what a peaceful life is. It is a life in which the mind has rest. Not rest from labors so much as rest from conflicting emotions. Rest from uncertain allegiances and wavering convictions. Rest also from the feelings of compulsion by others or by self. All of us at times long for peace of mind. We long to be able to act with feelings spontaneously, without second thoughts, or without restraining and dampening deliberations. Goodness of life, with its easiness and peace of mind, does not come at once. For a long while it is, at best, a visitor to our life, that comes and goes for longer or for shorter periods, now more strongly, now more weakly. And from the end, but the time will come when we will not experience conflict in living the life of truth. We'll discover that, in fact, God's yoke is easy and his burden is light. I love that reference at the end, and I have to thank Grant for the wise words yet again. That reference to Matthew 11:28 through 30, where Christ says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." What insightful, peaceful words from the one whom I believe was Divinity incarnate. I love how that quote starts. "Come to me, you who are labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And Christ goes on to say, as you come to me, you will continue to work. You will receive my yoke, but it's light. It will feel like you're at peace as you continue to move in the world, as you do my goodness. The goodness of divinity is what Christ is saying. The goodness from your higher power, from the lady within, as you listen to that spark of life within your spirit, that spiritual sun blazing within, you will find that the yoke that you're called to is very light. I want to thank you all for connecting with us today. I hope that you go forth finding your truth, willing to search for it, willing to look at how it speaks to your everyday living, your morality, your spirituality, and what practices are healthy in fulfilling that truth. What practices, what approaches allow you to take on that yoke a little more, to receive divinity a little more in your embodiment, and Also find that feeling where your shackles are being released and you're able to be more and more yourself without the deliberations, without the two-facedness, to more and more receive the honesty and integrity of the truth of the Divine One in all its infinite guises of goodness. Thank you so much for joining us. Join us anytime at Swedenborgiancommunity.org. Don't forget to subscribe and go forth knowing that you're quite loved